Would you rather live under a democracy or under a totalitarian monarchy? I really mean it. Think about the pros and cons of each regime. And if you analyze it under an emotionless lens, if for a moment we separate ourselves from our modern moral guidelines and look at it under a purely practical sense, it's actually not an easy question. The ancient Greeks had to ask themselves this question when Alexander the Great, in just 13 years, completely changed the political landscape of the time, decisively throwing away the old order of independent city-states and sending the Greeks into an age of huge kingdoms. Even the cities that still wanted to remain independent after him had no choice but to abdicate great part of their autonomy in order to organize themselves into leagues that could defend themselves from these new political behemoths. Under the previous order of classical Greek democracies, let's say you were a full citizen of a polis, you would have lived under a system where political power was widely diffused among the citizen body. Some cities concentrated its power amongst the elites, what we know today as oligarchies. Others were a bit more democratic in the sense we know today, but they all followed a general order. Major decisions were taken in an assembly. Any laws or decrees had to first be discussed and then approved by consensus, and anyone with official power only held this office for a predetermined term, becoming yet another citizen after this term, someone accountable to prosecution if they misused their temporary powers. During the Greco-Persian Wars, an exiled Spartan king in the court of Xerxes warned the Persian king that even if he was able to amass a huge army, even if he had the power to force hundreds of thousands of subjects and slaves into war, the Greeks were also, in their own way, slaves to the law. Xerxes wouldn't simply be picking off Greek cities one after the other. The Spartan was warning Xerxes that the Greeks might have looked fragmented, but they were very capable of harnessing great numbers of men and material due to their adherence to the laws, and these laws told them they had to fight in such situations. However, all of this changed in the late 4th century BC, under Alexander the Great. Alexander inaugurated what is called the Hellenistic period. He saw the Greek world reorganized under a radically new political system. Instead of a landscape dominated by independent polis, his idea was that he would be an emperor, a king of kings, and he would rule over satraps, effectively a lesser kind of king. This idea drew from Greek and Persian political traditions. This new empire that Alexander had in mind would have been because he died, because he could enacted a hybrid system in which Greek language and the local system of the city-state coexisted with a Persian-style system of centralized royal administration. The institution of the polis, with its assemblies, the citizen council, the legal structures, all of these would continue to exist and they remained important in local life, but they were now subject to a royal authority, where the king stood above all civic bodies. In practice, this meant that, however autonomous a city might claim to be, the king and his officials could overturn any local decisions. So, in short, the polis was a pale shadow of what it had been in the classical period. Alexander never saw this system in motion, dying all of a sudden at just 32 years of age, but his system was enacted by the new kingdoms that appeared from the fragmentation of his empire. And this concentration of power had its advantages. In any kind of totalitarian monarchy, authority was concentrated in the king, which in practical terms meant that he had the capacity to make rapid decisions, and he could harness the full economic and military potential of his kingdom in a way city-states either could not, because a part of the population would be against it, or the decision-making would require a lot of time and many days of talking between the parties. Another interesting point of monarchies is that a king's personal fortune, his prestige, well, his survival. It was all related to how well his dominions were doing during his reign, so any good monarch had an incentive to plan for the long term. We can see the opposite of this, an excess of short-term thinking in the way our modern democracies are run. Politicians think mostly about their short term in power, and that's it. Now, if you are a king, the kingdom is your kingdom. So ensuring safety, economic prosperity for your subjects, ruling well had a strong component of self-interest in it. You might not care about the slightest about your citizens, but if you could do something that would make these citizens a more profitable tax farm, you would do it. And it didn't matter if it would take 10 years for some of your measures to take effect. After all, you were king for life. And this was especially important in the context of the Hellenistic period. It was a highly competitive world of rival kings. If you faltered, if your kingdom did poorly, a neighboring kingdom could easily conquer you. But let's assume you are not the king, but one of his subjects. Yes, some long-term planning and stability was good, but that same concentration of power meant any legal protections for ordinary citizens. All of that was much weaker and more dependent on the character of a ruler. A just king could be an incredible protector, but someone corrupt, capricious, paranoid, and we know there were plenty of questionable characters throughout history that had a crown over their heads. This man was the law. He could confiscate property, bend the law, exile you, then he could just kill you with basically no legal constraints. This was the political situation a Greek had to live in during the post-Alexander world. And the coins issued under these new kingdoms are some of the most direct ways we can see this change in the political scenario. I'm a particular fan of Hellenistic coinage, and we have a spectacular selection of large silver and gold pieces today. So where do we start? Let's begin with the period shortly after the death of Alexander. Here we have a tetradrachm issued under King Lysimachus, one of Alexander's bodyguards, who carved for himself the region of Thrace. This coin was issued between 297 and 281 BC, so a few decades after Alexander's death. But there were still a lot of people alive who saw Alexander in person. Lysimachus used Alexander's image as well as his own fame as the personal bodyguard of such a legendary man to justify his right to rule. So instead of putting his own portrait on the coins, being blunt about it, he chose this image of a deified Alexander instead. We can see it's Alexander for the horns coming out of his head. Alexander was called the son of Ammon Zeus, and the god Ammon had horns, so it's clearly a divinized Alexander we're looking at here. On the reverse, we have Athena, the goddess of wisdom and of civilized life. I love this pose for the goddess. This design actually inspired statues and coin designs all the way to the 19th century. Here we have her in this vigilant, almost guardian-like pose, with her spear and her shield right next to her, as if she was ready to stand up from her throne and defend the Greek world. She holds out a tiny figure of Nike in her outstretched hand, and this little Nike, this victory, leans forward to crown with a laurel crown the inscription Basileus Lysimachus of King Lysimachus, the most explicit statement on the coin that his right to rule, the right of Lysimachus, was divinely sanctioned. I love just how tactful the approach of Lysimachus was in this coin. At first sight, one might think he's a humble monarch. Maybe he relies on Alexander, on the goddess. They are the real important figures here, until you realize Nike is crowning his name. Then you realize Lysimachus was claiming divine right to rule for himself. He was stating he was clearly superior to you. This kind of propaganda strategy was not exclusive to Lysimachus. In the first few decades after Alexander's death, the transition from coins with purely civic symbols to those showing portraits of living kings was gradual. Previously, city-states made coins primarily with images of gods, mythological heroes, and local civic symbols, like the Athenian owls is a great example. It's like if money was, in a sense, the territory of the gods, or of less tangible contexts, like the context of the whole city issuing the coin. So the main portrait of a coin was expected to be a deity, something from mythology, or just a representation of a people. For a mere man, a mortal, to occupy that sacred space on this object, it must have been seen as of very bad taste, if not just a complete sacrilege. As if a politician was claiming the honors and visibility proper to a god. It was one thing to put a name of a magistrate responsible for a coin issue on a coin, that happened quite often, but to put someone's face in a space reserved for the gods? Oh no. With Alexander and the Hellenistic kings, however, a new ideology emerged in which rulers increasingly justified their authority by presenting themselves as chosen by the gods. We could clearly see that in the Lysimachus coin, and this trend would only get more intense as the centuries passed, with some kings giving themselves just straight up divine attributes, effectively making them gods on earth, rather than humans sanctioned by the gods. And this week's episode is proudly sponsored by Alhambra Precious Metals. Ran by two very passionate ancient coin collectors and with years of experience in the numismatic and bullion markets, this business offers a finely curated selection of ancient coins. It's really nice to see the American coin market beginning to see businesses with a high level of expertise in ancient coins. Offering a wide selection of Roman, Greek, Byzantine, among other types of ancients, every coin they sell is guaranteed authentic for life. These are people who handle ancients every single day and understand the provenance, grading, and proper identification and attribution, as well as the realities of today's coin market. I'm really delighted to be able to feature a business with what I consider some of the best market practices out there. So if you've been thinking about adding a new ancient coin to your collection from a reputable source, or a great place where you can acquire precious metals to your portfolio, make sure to check them out at alhambra-preciousmetals.com. And we can start seeing this, how may I put it, sanctifying trend on our next coin, a wonderful tetradrachm issued between 312 and 281 BC by Seleucus I, the founder of the Seleucid Empire. On the obverse, the coin shows this very visually striking helmeted bust. We actually don't know who is depicted in this coin. There's no explicit mention of who it is, and that might have been done on purpose. It could be Seleucus, and I'm sure many of you would have believed it was him, but there are lots of visual cues that could indicate this might be instead an idealized image of Alexander. The panther skin helmet and the animal ear both connected this person to Dionysus, and the bull's horn, just like in the previous coin of Lysimachus, is yet another indication of divinity. In this case, a divine symbol that was already associated to Alexander personally. You know what, the more I look at it, the more I think this over-the-top design actually fits Seleucus better. I mean, first of all, this type of portrait normally has the features of an older man. Most of Alexander's images show him as a very youthful man. After all, he died in his 30s, there was no old Alexander, but also because Seleucus adopted a much more aggressive style of propaganda. He presented himself in this quasi-divine image from the start. He was also one of the Hellenistic kings to most successfully establish this personality cult around himself. For example, he established a new dating system for his kingdom, which counted the year 1 as the year he entered the city of Babylon and officially established his kingdom. Many of his eastern subjects, more accustomed to a godlike king, a remnant from the Achaemenid times, would also have accepted this image easily, this image of a god compared to the Greeks, who were maybe a little bit more rational. Heading to the reverse, we have this very visually charged scene, so cool. There's this full body image of the goddess of victory, Nike, adjusting in some variations of this die, placing a laurel crown on a newly erected tropaion. The tropaion was a type of battle trophy. It was this statue made out of captured arms and armor that was raised in a battlefield by the victorious army as a way to thank the gods for favoring them. This coin was probably a commemorative issue, celebrating Seleucus's military achievements in subjugating his eastern territories under his centralized rule. It could also be a reference to his victories on the west during the wars of the successor states and this whole chaotic period after Alexander's death. He was a very good general after all. We then have the legends Basileus Seleuco of King Seleucus. Next, let's head south. Let's go to Egypt. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, quickly claimed the territory of Egypt for himself, establishing the most stable and longest living of the successor kingdoms. The kingdom sat in this very privileged position. You had ruthless deserts guarding it from the west, from the east, and from the south, and to the north you had the Mediterranean Sea, so invasions were very hard and very expensive. And all of the prosperity of the kingdom, the majority of it, was tightly concentrated around the shores of the Nile. It was a very predictable river, and the sheer volume of water it carried enabled rich civilizations to flourish on its shores for millennia. Because you see, it always flooded on schedule. It brought with it, when it flooded, lots of nutrients and constantly refertilized its shores. And of course, you add to that the warm temperatures and plenty of sun that helped plant life develop. And this meant that this narrow strip of land was just incredibly productive. So this combination of fertile lands and easily defensible territories made Egypt far more stable and wealthier than its neighbors. The position of Egypt, and especially its capital, its new capital, Alexandria, was also very suitable for trade. Alexandria linked the Mediterranean world to Africa. It was also connected to Asia and Arabia through land and through the Red Sea. So, in a way, it was a pivotal kingdom where goods could easily move towards Europe, Africa, or Asia, and of course further out in the Indian subcontinent. And on top of that, if the land wasn't wealthy enough, there was gold too, lots of it. It's the eastern deserts of Egypt. It's a very harsh land, but it was full of gold. And to the south, you had access to the mines of Nubia. So there was a constant supply of gold, which allowed the Ptolemies to strike some of the largest and most impressive gold coins the ancient world had ever seen to this point. What we have here is a mnaion of Ptolemy II, son of the first Ptolemy. This coin was issued in the golden age of the Ptolemies. It's contemporary to some legendary structures like the Lighthouse of Alexandria and the Library of Alexandria. One mnaion like this one was an obscene amount of money concentrated in a single coin. It was worth 100 silver drachma, a full mina of silver. Minas and talents were the big, bookkeeping units, the units of account used in agreements between states or the biggest and most important merchants. This single coin was the equivalent of around 2 months of work for a qualified labor, maybe 3 months for an unskilled one. So as you can see, this is an unusual looking coin. It has 2 portraits instead of 1. That's because this is a commemorative issue made between 272 and 270 BC. It marked the marriage between Ptolemy II and his sister, Arsinoe. This might not sound like the smartest reproductive strategy, but you see, the Ptolemies were very smart in their royal propaganda. They presented themselves as Greek kings for the small number of ethnic Greeks that composed the Egyptian elite at that time, but they also acted as divine pharaohs for their native Egyptian subjects. And sibling marriage was a part of the old pharaonic tradition. So in the obverse, you get the portraits of Ptolemy and Arsinoe side by side, with the short legend at the top, Adelphon, meaning of the siblings, marking this blood relationship in a very explicit way. Heading to the reverse, we see more of that image of a royal bloodline, of this continuity of the Ptolemaic lineage, with two more portraits, those of Ptolemy I, the original founder of the dynasty, and his wife, Berenike. Above them, it reads Theon, of the gods. I have visited Egypt a couple of years ago, and many of the Ptolemaic temples, which are in remarkably good shape, they are indistinguishable from the older temples of native pharaohs. It's really impressive. They commissioned temples that portrayed themselves, these foreign kings, not in this Greek style that we're used to, but in perfect pharaonic style. And that was a very tactful approach on the part of the Ptolemies, because by the time of the Hellenistic period, this claim of godhood, it wasn't unusual to this broader Hellenistic world. Alexander had already wrapped himself in these heroic and divine associations, from his claim that his dynasty descended from Heracles to this public image he gave himself later in his reign that his conquests were not just fruit of his competence as a general, but also a clear sign of heaven's favor. And after his death, his successor kings, at least the smart ones, they just continued this tactic of giving themselves divine attributes to justify their reigns. After all, if you once served under the godlike Alexander and now you held some of his territories, it must have meant that the same pantheon that approved of Alexander also gave you their blessing. Alright, for the next coin, how about we head back to Macedon and look at some of the last Macedonian kings. Let's check out this wonderful tetradrachma struck between 188 and 184 BC by Philip V. Philip was the last great Macedonian king. Compared to the other successor kingdoms, the homeland of Alexander fell in a period of relative obscurity during the mid to late Hellenistic period. In the 2nd century BC, Rome started expanding throughout the Mediterranean, and Greek influence started to fade. And initially, when the Romans started encroaching into the Greek mainland, Philip here mounted a very staunch resistance against the Romans, initially inflicting many defeats on Rome. Even later on, when Rome finally managed to beat him, Philip negotiated some relatively favorable terms, managing to keep Macedonian independence and forcing the Romans to wait until he was dead to once again try to annex Greece. So let's have a look at this lovely tetradrachma of him, made either on Pella, the old capital, or Amphipolis, one of its main cities. And I mean, just look at that piece of art. The whole obverse is convex, and it's like shaped like a shield, you know, the old hoplite shield used by the Greek heavy infantry, and it has some decorations in the shape of semicircles and stars around the rim. And it's not just any star, it's the Star of Macedon, the old symbol of Macedon under Alexander. I mean, there's such an eye for detail on every visual element on this coin. At the center, we have this circle, which houses a lovely portrait of Philip, wearing a winged helmet with a little griffin head at its top. And behind him, we have a harpe, a kind of sword used by Greek infantry. The whole theme of this coin shows defiance. It was struck later in his reign, after his defeat to the Romans, but as we can see here, it still clearly advertises he was willing to defend Macedon's independence. I know I'm biased and I tend to favor Hellenistic coins against earlier periods as far as its aesthetics, but this coin is just a delight to look at. On the reverse, we have a wreath made out of oak leaves. It's interesting to see the use of a different type of plant to make this wreath. Most of these are generally made with laurel or olive leaves, so it's interesting to see a little bit of variation here. At the center, we have the Club of Heracles, another show of strength, defiance against the Romans on the part of Philip, and at the top and bottom parts of the club, the inscription Basileus Philippo of King Philip. A simple design, but once more, so elegant, so well balanced. You might also notice that If you look at other examples of these late Hellenistic tetradrachma, these are much larger than previous coins. They're generally over 26 millimeters in diameter, sometimes going over 30 millimeters. And this generated a problem in which the far edges of the coin, close to the rims, they would become structurally flimsy, like the silver would be stretched out too thinly. By adding this crown here on the reverse, this crown that went around the area of the rim, it added more metal to the outer edge of the coin, serving as this visual feature, of course, but also as a structural reinforcement to the coin. It's an early example of function going side by side with form, with aesthetic elements. It's so smart. After Philip, we have Perseus, who was the complete opposite of his father. He was weak, he was ineffective. Basically, his reign feels like a lesson on how to waste a golden inheritance. His father, despite having lost a war to the Romans, managed to retain a considerable level of independence, a rather stable political situation, and he left his son with a prosperous kingdom and a decent army that could hold its own. So, through a mix of terrible diplomacy, bad political decisions, Perseus managed to alienate all of his potential allies, and this made Macedon an easy prey for Rome and its expansionist policy. The end result was a humiliated Perseus, paraded in Rome as a prisoner of war, and the once great Macedon carved into 4 obedient puppet states that would soon be annexed by Rome as yet another province. Well, at least Perseus left us with some wonderful coins, like this tetradrachma struck between 171 and 168 BC. On the obverse, we have a more traditional formula for a Hellenistic portrait. Now we have just a side-facing bust of Perseus looking to the right, wearing the diadem of the Hellenistic kings, a visual element present on portraits all the way back to the first successors of Alexander. The bust of Perseus is remarkably similar to that of his father, up to the facial hair. It would make sense, after all, his father was very well liked, so he would have wanted to emulate him. On the reverse, once more a familiar formula to the previous coin. We have that crown made out of oak leaves around the edge of the reverse, which served as a decorative element as well as a structural reinforcement, and at the center, instead of the club of Heracles, now we have the ego of Zeus, perched over a thunderbolt. The legends also follow the same formula. Now it reads Basileus Perseus, of King Perseus. Yet another lovely coin, although this is a bit of a sad coin. After all, it marked the end of an independent Macedon. Alexander would have been so disappointed. And finally, for our last coin of today, a bit of a curiosity. A coin issued by a distant Greek successor kingdom, far removed from the Hellenistic sphere in the Mediterranean. In the region of modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and western India, the furthest reaches of Alexander's original conquests, the Bactrians, later known as the Indo-Greeks, persisted as late as the 1st century AD, long after all the other Hellenistic kingdoms had fallen. These Greek kings in the Far East issued coins in Greek style, written in Greek language, and their numismatic legacy would last for centuries, deeply influencing Indian numismatics. What we have here is a tetradrachma issued by Demetrius I, also called Demetrius Aniketos, or the Unconquered, for his many conquests in the Indian subcontinent. This tetradrachma was issued between 200 and 180 BC, and as you can see, despite being so far removed from the Greek sphere, the Bactrians produced coins perfectly consistent with what was seen in the Hellenistic world. We have this wonderful portrait of the king looking right, and notice the really cool headgear he's wearing in the shape of an elephant. The elephant was the symbol of India for the Greeks. Some coins issued right after Alexander's death show him wearing the elephant headdress to celebrate his conquests in India, and Demetrius here imitated the type. We can also see right under the headdress a little bit of the royal diadem once again poking out of the headgear, showing he was the king of Bactria. Many of these Bactrian and later Indo-Greek kings converted to Buddhism and Indian cultural influence, actually made its way to some of their coins. Some were even issued in two languages, Greek and the local Kharoshthi language. This one, however, shows how Menander maybe wanted to reinforce Greek supremacy over his Indian subjects. None of that cultural melding here. The reverse is only in Greek. We have an image of a naked Heracles holding the skin of the Nemean lion and holding his club, and to his left and right sides, simple legends, Basileus Demetrio, of King Demetrius. I'm starting to see Bactrian coinage receive the attention it deserves in Western markets, and I think people should pay more attention to these. Not only do these coins have great artistic quality, they look fantastic, it really doesn't owe anything to the Mediterranean coins in regards to artistic quality, but especially for those who collect for the history, the artistic, and this cultural aspect of coinage, this melding of Eastern and Western influences as coinage evolves with time and the Greek designs start becoming influenced by Indian culture. It's really fascinating. The blending of cultures, it's wonderfully illustrated in Bactrian coinage. And here we have it, a beautiful showcase of Hellenistic coinage issued by the political descendants of Alexander the Great throughout the centuries. So, I want to hear from you. Which Hellenistic kingdoms do you like the most? Let us know in the comment section down below. And make sure to check out Alhambra Precious Metals, where these coins you're seeing in this video, as well as other wonderful coins, are up for sale. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this episode, happy collecting, and I'll see you soon. Let me give a special thank you to all of my amazing channel members and Patreons for their generous support. This channel would not be the same without your help. And if you would like to be part of this list, have early access to my videos when they are uploaded to YouTube, and a series of other perks, make sure to check out my Patreon page and my members tab on YouTube. Thank you very much.